I'm going to cut right to the chase here with a brief introduction. You have the biographies of our two panelists. Those haven't changed. You probably noticed that since we sent out the invitations, the situation has changed enormously over the weekend, so it's very different. Tony Badran is an FDD senior fellow and an expert on the Levant. John Hanna is a policy expert who has worked for Secretary of State Warren Christopher and as a national security advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. And I think I'm going to start with Tony and ask you to kind of set the table for us. And by that, what I mean by that is this. Talk, first of all, is there any question that chemical weapons were used? Is there any question who is responsible for their use? And then also, again, just so we establish what's going on, what, as you see it, and this is controversial, is the state of the civil war inside Syria right now?
Great. Thanks, Cliff, and thanks everybody for coming. That's really the heart of the question in terms of everybody's asking. Everybody who's on the skeptical side is asking why would Bashar al-Assad use chemical weapons at this juncture, especially if, as the narrative had been going certainly since June, since the fall of the town of Qusayr in the Homs countryside, with the help of Hezbollah, which everybody heralded as kind of the watershed moment that is going to shift the momentum, or that had shifted the momentum back to the regime, and that the rebels were on their back foot, and so on. I never necessarily held much credence to this. Not just because these types of wars have constantly tend to change momentum, but because there was never ever any other Syrian nationwide advance for the regime. So its advances were really, when you look at it, when you kind of step back and look at it, ends up being a couple of towns here and there in the Homs countryside and nowhere else. On the contrary, on the other side, when we look at the rebel advances during that time, they have been consistent, small, steady, but consistent. And you see them everywhere. In the south, near the Jordanian border, there's been a critical development with Saudi help down through Jordan. And the rebels are very surely and steadily gaining ground. Which, by the way, is very few kilometers away from Damascus itself. So you can have a pipeline directly from Jordan straight into the heart of Damascus. But the most important part had been these suburbs northeast of Damascus, which is where the attack happened now. But it wasn't the first time that the attack had happened. This was where the other attack back in the spring had happened, exactly the same neighborhoods. So it's not a coincidence. There's a reason for it, and the reason is part of the territorial strategy, that if the Assad regime needs to control these areas. They are in sensitive locations near critical airports, slightly to the east, where Iranian supplies especially are coming in from. They also are like a few 500 meters away from the heart of Damascus, the capital itself, one of their neighborhoods. So this is an area that he needed to control, had not been able to control. And this is the assessment that we've seen in especially the French intelligence, which has been the most comprehensive. It's not just US intelligence or Israeli intelligence. You're having now everybody coming out. The British have a dossier on it. The French have an impeccable dossier on it. The Germans are starting to come out. And by the way, these are not people who are invested in starting a war with Syria, all right? Specifically the Germans I'm talking about. So these are people who are really just sharing intelligence intercepts that they found. The most recent one was the German security services intercepted a discussion between a senior Hezbollah official and the Iranian embassy, reportedly discussing the order that Assad gave to attack with chemical weapons. And the way it's been described by the German officials was that the Hezbollah official told the Iranians that Assad had, lost it and made the attack. So it was an act, if anything, more of rage and frustration than of confidence and gaining ground. So the whole narrative of how we see the war in Syria and where this chemical attack comes in really runs counter to the prevailing line that we've been seeing in the media starting since June especially. So I think when you place it in that context, and in the context of the U.S. president not having followed through on his warning the first time, so the increased necessity to use them in a sort of tactical battlefield sense, and with the calculation on the part of the regime that the West is just not going to interfere because they didn't the first time. There was ample evidence that the French had given, and nobody moved. The Turks came to Washington. Erdogan brought with him his intel minister, his intel chief, with reportedly a dossier about chemical weapons use. And at the time, everybody was like, we're not going to really do anything about this at this point. So I think it kind of led to this point for the second use, and now we find ourselves where we are. So
let me just stop there a bit. If I were summing up, I would say that your argument would be that chemical weapons were used, and there's no question that Assad used them. That much is pretty clear. Right. Let me go to John to ask, at least to start, with the second part, which is the state of the civil war. And I'm not sure we have great intelligence on this. You may know more than I do. And I think although there are a lot of intrepid reporters who have gone to Syria, they're kind of exploring the Grand Canyon at night with a flashlight because they may not be able to move from one block to the next literally without taking their lives in their hands. Do we know if Assad is winning, losing, the state of battle?
First, let me thank Cliff and FTD and Tony for the panel, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm looking forward to the discussion. First, let me say that this is really, truly, we need to all appreciate what an amazing point in history we are here, where President Obama has staked his presidency on getting America into another Middle East conflict. I mean, this is the supreme
Can't make this stuff up.
Irony that, you really have to believe God has a wonderful sense of humor in this regard. I mean, Tony is much more informed on this than me. I think this conflict has gone through peaks and valleys and ups and downs, with one side up one day or 1 week, 1 month, and then the other side up the next. I think there is a real danger of getting caught in the day-to-day, as a lot of people did at Qusair, and expecting this was the end. Now Assad, having taken Qusair, having had that kind of significant and very impactful intervention by Hezbollah in that fight, that the battle would soon be over. I heard people talking similarly about the rebels in perhaps late 2012 as they were proceeding toward Damascus. So I think there's a real danger of people overdrawing their conclusions from what they are perceiving on a day-to-day basis, and it's important to try to take yourself out of that, and I think Tony probably does that better than anybody else. So when he says, listen, since Qusair, this is by no means a conflict that Assad and the regime are dominating, that the rebels have in different places made significant gains, that threats that Assad has made regarding Aleppo being the next target, or being able to even retake these neighborhoods in Damascus, which was a complete failure and frustration for him. And I think, having tried everything else, he was concerned enough and he had enough, as Tony mentioned, of an incentive of embarrassing the President of the United States, particularly on the anniversary of the drawing of the red line on CW, that he decided he was emboldened enough to go ahead, and he did have a military objective in getting the rebels out of those key essential neighborhoods in Damascus, and everything else had failed. So I think we are very much still in a very kind of grinding stalemate. I mean, by no means believe that the rebels are about to take Damascus and Assad is about to collapse, but I think my sense is that as it is currently going on, even with the deployment of CW, as horrible as it is, my sense is that without any major variable changing, particularly regarding outside intervention, that we're in for a pretty long, grinding, bloody fight that is only going to be to grow more dangerous for certainly for Syrians, but also for long-term U.S. interests in terms of sort of a spreading chaos throughout the region, including touching a lot of very key U.S. allies.
Let me follow up with you first, and then we'll go to Tony. What, in your view, is the strongest rationale for using military force now against Assad? In other words, is it, and just go through the list, there's the R2P, responsibility to protect. Some on the left are making that case. There are those who would reject that, but say nonetheless, there must be consequences when chemical weapons are used. They've been banned since 1925. There must be consequences when women and children are targeted. That is a crime against humanity, a war crime, state terrorism. That's been taboo for probably since the Middle Ages. And that if you don't, if there are no consequences, if it's cost-free to do that, you've essentially licensed it. There are those who say none of that matters. We should only be looking at the Civil War and how we want that to be shaped by our actions. Values should not come into play, only interests. What's your take on it, then, Tony? Well,
I guess
that's yours.
I guess what I would say, and this is, I think, contrary to perhaps a lot of, or at least some of my colleagues on the more conservative side, is that I don't have a problem with the red line the president drew. I actually believe that the United States does have very important and vital interests that extend beyond the Syrian civil war on upholding the taboo that exists regarding the deployment of chemical weapons in particular, and weapons of mass destruction more generally. And for all kinds of reasons, I think the United States has a discrete and separate interest in upholding that taboo. Now, I differ from the president in that I think he ought to have seen that we have vital interests beyond the issue of chemical weapons, which I do believe touches a vital interest of the United States, into the broader Syrian conflict and the kind of impact allowing this conflict to go on as long as it has, with all the parade of terribles that have happened in terms of a humanitarian crisis, the implosion of the state, fracturing of the state, the rise of radicalism, and the kind of boost this has given al-Qaeda to establish a serious and concerning presence inside of Syria. The failure to take advantage of the ability, I think, certainly early on, and I still think is the case, given the amount the Iranians have actually invested into Syria and how important they see it to their strategic position in the region, the failure by the United States to deliver that kind of knockout blow early on against this vital link in the Iranian chain of resistance throughout the region, and the kind of momentum that would have given us and leverage it would have given us on the whole question, the big 800-pound gorilla in the room of the Iranian nuclear program. So I'm glad the president drew the red line. I think it was justifiable. I've got terrible, terrible issues with how he's managed both that and how he's managed this whole issue of getting it to the Congress and seeking a congressional support for it. But again, in principle, I think that that the CW red line as a justification for American action, given the broad-scale use of these, to allow that to happen in a militarily decisive way with impunity, I think opens the door to a very, very dark future for the region and for the United States in particular, and for the entire global liberal international order. So I think the risks of us doing nothing and that kind of dark future opening up is sufficiently high in this kind of circumstance that it does warrant a serious exercise of American power to uphold this taboo.
Tony, your perspective on that?
I have little to add to that, actually, but in terms of one thing I would like to emphasize what John was saying is that while the idea of an intervention was framed at first narrowly as a response to chemical weapons, which is appropriate, right? But it is not a narrow issue, and it's not just how we view the situation, but also how all of our allies, who are, by the way, all around Syria, view the situation as well. So there is a sort of a balance of power issue in the region as well. So the chemical weapons are not in a vacuum. There's a regime that uses them, and that's the regime that's responsible for them. So it's not just the chemical weapons in and of themselves. There's a regime, the regime that's responsible for them, and then there is that regime's ties to Iran and the link that John drew that takes us from there all the way to Tehran, and what that means for the region. So the fight in Syria is more than just that. It's a fight about really the direction of the region and the balance of power in the region. Syria is not a major state in the region. That much is clear. But Syria is a crossroads state, and that's been its role historically as well. So I think everybody is looking at that, from Turkey to Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Everybody is looking how the United States is going to lead in shaping where that crossroad will take us.
I'm going to ask another few questions, but if you want to ask questions while they're answering, signal me. Just raise your hand a little bit, and I'll notice, and then we'll go to you pretty soon. We'll have people with microphones. There are those who are saying, interestingly, Dennis Kucinich on the left, Rand Paul on the right, that if we attack Assad, we will objectively be aligning ourselves with al-Qaeda, which has sort of two divisions, as you all know, in Syria, the Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Nusra Front, and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. John, start on that. Are we aligning ourselves with al-Qaeda if we attack Assad?
I mean, that's a very provocative way, obviously, of putting it, but I think it's, to some extent, we find ourselves in a situation where perhaps, if it's an effective U.S. military strike to degrade the regime's military capabilities and abilities to terrorize its population, it will assist the armed opposition and the broader opposition to the Assad regime that's trying to take it down. One part of that, and one growing and not insignificant part of that, are the al-Qaeda affiliated groups. So I think it's very hard to dispute that. To my mind, that simply, argues for a much broader American strategy that thinks beyond simply enforcing the taboo with respect to CW. For me, the entire conflict, if you want to affect this conflict, the critical question for me has always been, can you actually build an effective Syrian partner on the ground that may not be a bunch of Jeffersonian Democrats, but are people that are prepared to both fight this regime, deliver this kind of blow to Iran, and then turn around and ensure that the jihadists and al-Qaeda don't ultimately win the greatest advantage from this conflict, that is able to do things that are consistent with American interests in terms of exercising some control, at least in areas around Damascus and the rest of the countries where Sunnis are dominant, but also, for instance, on the question of CW and being able to get control of those weapons, assist the United States in getting control of those weapons and preventing their proliferation either to Hezbollah or al-Qaeda. So I think that, I recognize the kind of sort of perplexing tension that you mentioned, Cliff, with regard to any American military strike. That's not an argument for me against a strike. It's an argument in favor of doing what we haven't done to this point, which is actually building a Syrian partner. Now, we can debate, is that still possible in the Syrian conflict? I listen to people like Tony. I listen to people like Andrew Tabler and Jeff White at the Washington Institute, some with a lot of military experience who have been on the ground talking to the opposition, Elizabeth O'Baggy, who's been on the ground talking to opposition on multiple occasions. Some other scholars. There's an article that I commend to everybody on August 9th in Foreign Policy magazine about on the website about the state of the Syrian opposition, and that there remains a real and viable armed opposition and fighting force that is not al-Qaeda, is not jihadist, is not looking to build the broader international caliphate, and are people that the United States can work with, and there are countries in the region who have worked with these people successfully. I would do that if the United States, if the president gets this authorization, and I think this is more controversial, I would also, in addition to hitting the regime, I think very, very seriously about us identifying targets for the Islamic State or for al-Nusra and hitting those as well, and really taking those forces down a notch as well.
That raises a question. You want to answer before I ask the next question? It raises the next question for me.
If you want to ask, and I can come back to it, it's fine.
Well, say a couple of words about the possibility that hitting Assad objectively strengthens al-Qaeda, which is not in our interest.
I mean, I've never framed it in that way. I mean, do we, okay, if you want to frame it a little provocatively, do we and the al-Qaeda groups that are operating in Syria, do we share an enemy? Yes, the Assad regime, right? However, we also have friends and assets and local allies who are themselves against Assad, but also not in any way aligned with al-Qaeda either. And I'm not talking about just the local Syrian factions. I'm talking more importantly about their external sponsors. And this is where the article that you mentioned, John, in Foreign Policy by Thomas Pierret, it's really a very important piece, because he starts talking about how you need state sponsorship for the next kind of level of combat that we are in, and for the next stage that's coming ahead, where you need specific types of weaponry that these guys and their private donors in the Gulf. And by the way, there are no state sponsors for these groups, the ISIS and the Jabhat al-Nusra. These are mainly private donors, sort of. Jabhat al-Nusra is a bit more obscure, but so these guys, you have a lot of other control mechanisms that in a once the Assad regime is toppled, and the myriad of other factions and their local regional sponsors, that combination is going to put tremendous pressure on the ability of the al-Qaeda groups to dominate. And when we talk about dominate, remember, I mean, we're talking about controlling territory. We're talking about the ability by force to impose your will on the rest. And if you just look at the record of how these guys are fighting on the ground, especially in places like when they're fighting now with the PKK affiliate in northeastern Syria, it's not that impressive. Same applies to the idea of them leading the fight against the regime. Well, a lot of these areas that that saw protracted sieges and battles, yeah, these guys may have come in at the last moment, but the only way you can sustain these battles and these sieges, and the ability, for instance, in the case of the Minag airport in northern Syria that was recently taken by the rebels finally after about a year of siege, the introduction of specific weapons, anti-tank weapons system that were only given to the FSA, not the ISIS and all these guys, that introduction of those weapons, along with the sustained effort that had been going on for a month, that is what led to the collapse. And these guys, yeah, okay, may have come on top of it, but these guys aren't leading it. So I think, the idea of portraying this in such broad terms that, these guys are just going to come in and take over, I find it to be not really convincing.
Let me follow up in this way. Your assessment of the Free Syrian Army, General Salim Idris, would it be that, to use John's word, no, not Jeffersonian Democrats, but nationalists, and certainly not the people who would say, oh, great, let's have a Taliban state here in Syria, we'll accept that.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there's, even within the Islamist sector of the opposition, there are like different shades, right? I mean, you're ranging from, hardcore Salafis that are not al-Qaeda, by the way, like Ahrar al-Sham and so on. I mean, this is one part of the equation, all the way to communal Islamic, just the way, let's say, like if you want to put a different an analogy, not a perfect one, let's say in the Lebanese Shia context during the Lebanese Civil War, the Amal movement as a sectarian, communal, by no means secular movement, to Hezbollah, sort of ideological Islamist movement with an Islamist program, right? You have that kind of diversity even within the Islamic setting of, and even within the al-Qaeda setting. You mentioned the division between Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State. One of the interesting things about Jabhat al-Nusra is how it has avoided talk of and the rest of them, incidentally, this talk of a universal caliphate and sort of all that stuff, much more emphasized on the Syrian context. And I wouldn't be surprised, incidentally, if we see a reinvention within the al-Qaeda setting of a historical Iraqi-Syrian rivalry that we saw with the Syrian versus Iraqi Ba'ath, for instance, or that we see between the different branches of the brotherhoods, Muslim brotherhoods sometimes. So I would not necessarily put that as beyond the realm of the possible, that within the Islamic setting there will be tremendous divisions as well.
Briefly, what is your estimate of or appraisal of the state of relations between Muslim Brotherhood and the al-Qaeda groups?
Oh, they're not very good at all. I mean, some of the groups, Muslim Brotherhood doesn't really control any militia on the ground. They have tried to kind of graft themselves onto existing militias by giving them support and so on, but it doesn't really buy you loyalty. But some of them that have been identified as somehow close to the Muslim Brotherhood, they've had fights with the al-Qaeda types, mainly not so much necessarily over ideological reasons so much as for the control of resources, which is what these kinds of conflicts boils down to. So like control over certain border crossings and the lucrative business that comes with that. So they've been like mutual assassinations and fights between them. So they're clearly not in a single camp.
Go ahead, John, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, no, I would, I think important in this context is to keep in mind that the state of the broader international Muslim Brotherhood has taken a major hit. I think that's an important context. I think that bleeds out into Muslim Brotherhood, or should bleed out and affect and impact the strength of Muslim Brotherhood movements throughout the region if we play our cards right, particularly on the Egyptian case. So I again wouldn't necessarily overestimate their strength inside of Syria, and I think there's a real chance, given what they've seen Muslim Brotherhood rule means in Egypt, which is a country, with 10% minority, 90% fairly religious Sunni Arabs, given its failure there, to believe that it can be a great success inside of Syria, which is a much more diverse and cosmopolitan and literate society historically than Egypt has ever been. I just think it's going to have a very uphill battle. All of these sort of radical Islamist groups, much harder than it appears right now, when everybody is kind of unified fighting this common enemy in the regime. Let me just make two more points related to this whole question of the opposition. First, I may be naive and stupid, but I still have some kind of confidence that the U.S. intelligence community, given the kinds of budgets that they have, that Edward Snowden may or may not have talked about and revealed, that they have those kinds of resources, that they have friendly and stable and secure platforms encircling Syria, that they've got 2 million Syrians outside of the country. They have, I don't know how many tens of thousands of Syrians inside the country prepared to take up arms and go fight this barbaric regime, that our CIA and our special forces are not capable of taking advantage of this kind of situation, working with pretty effective liaison services throughout the region on Syria's borders that we have very good relationships working with historically, and putting together a pretty serious force on the ground that is going to have to be reckoned with, both in the fight against Assad and in any kind of post-Assad future. If there's a serious push and demand by the President of the United States to make this happen, and the intelligence community and our military believe they're going to have real top cover from our Commander-in-Chief, that this is a high national priority to build that kind of force on the ground, that kind of partner on the ground for us in Syria. The second thing I'd mention, and Tony mentioned it, is I think we got to think really seriously now. This Syrian state that we've known up into 2011, I believe, is finished. You can't put it back. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's going to be a much different entity going forward. I don't know exactly what it'll look like, but I don't think it's going to be the decentralized kind of Arab nationalist state that it was before 2011. It's going to be a much more decentralized looking entity. I think at some level we should welcome that and shape that. And I think we've got to begin engaging with this Kurdish phenomenon up in northwest Syria in a much more aggressive and strategic way. As Tony said, the last several months, very unreported, they've been going, toe-to-toe with Jabhat al-Nusra and giving a hell of a lot better than they're taking from these guys. They are really pounding these guys and demonstrating that for a well-trained, reasonably well-armed force that's cohesive, Jabhat al-Nusra can be defeated on the battlefield quite easily. So my sense is whatever the U.S. does with the opposition, this Kurdish angle is a very underexplored, underexploited potential asset in America's overall strategy towards this conflict in the long term.
A lot of things to dig into there, but let's start with a question from Fred Flights. The microphone's coming. I'll recognize some of you, obviously, but not all of you, so introduce yourself when you get the microphone. Thanks.
Thank you. Fred Flights with LinkNet.com. The Assad regime reportedly is planning on defending military targets with human shields, and these targets supposedly are opposition members who have been in prison for almost 28 months. Do you believe this, and how serious a problem will this be for the Obama's campaign's plan to bomb?
I mean, I've seen the reports. Do I believe it? Yeah. I mean, I don't put anything beyond them. They certainly. I mean, why not? If you're going to have a propaganda photo op afterwards, to come in and say, look, the innocent people that the attack of the Obama administration have. Yeah, it's possible. The bigger issue for me is, first of all, what we end up hitting, right? And not just the time that elapsed and how that is going to affect the target selection because of their ability to move assets, but if you are going, let's say, to target an airport or an air base, a military air base, which is one of the things that I think should be definitely high on the target list, you must ask what innocent civilians were doing at a military air base should that actually end up taking place, so that you would know then that these guys move people and so on. Might there be civilian casualties? Yeah, I'm pretty sure there might be, but it's funny to watch the reactions of Syrians online, on Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that, who are reacting to precisely this kind of question, and they're saying, well, you know what, we've been getting killed for the last 2.5 years, and if this is not going to be the thing that's going to make it or break it for us in terms of whether we want American intervention that we've been clamoring for 2.5 years, but they find it as a necessary move.
Cliff, let me just
sure.
say on this, it's slightly separate topic, but it seems to me if I was I do take seriously all these issues about dispersal and human shields and moving military targets. I've seen lots of military people, and not only General Dempsey, but others, independent military analysts who have said that we in fact do have time, that we don't lose a lot militarily by allowing this debate to occur in the Congress. I'm not, I'm not a military person. I'm not sure that's the case, but it does seem to be a matter that's at least in dispute, that there will be sufficient number of targets out there for the United States to hit if we proceed accordingly to do real damage and inflict real cost and pain on the Assad regime. And I think General Jack Keane was out today, obviously having gotten briefed by somebody who wanted to try and shape his views on Fox News, saying that in fact, as McCain and Graham did yesterday, that the target set may be quite a bit broader than the administration first led on with its statements about shots across the bow and doing just enough not to be mocked. One thing I would say, if we still have any shred of credibility with the rebels, and we can somehow convince them that in fact this is only a delay, not an end to the prospect of an American military operation, it does seem to me that with the Syrians kind of trying to get out of the way, abandon headquarters, safeguard key regime assets and military forces, that this is a great time for some kind of relatively coordinated rebel offensive against key targets, to at least bring these people back out into the field from the 4th Division and the Republican Guard, to create some real targets for the United States over the next week or 2 weeks. This is the time to engage these guys when they are on the defensive and trying to seek cover.
It kind of happened, by the way, incidentally, on a small scale in Mount Qasyoun, which is the principal hill in central Damascus where the 4th Division is based and where it shells the opposition neighborhoods. Supposedly, this is all based on opposition reporting, that when the strike was initially announced and thought to be imminent, a lot of these positions were vacated. And they were looking at it very nervously because they thought that the opposition will make a move. So what they did, according to their rebel reporting, is that they moved a lot of the artilleries into civilian neighborhoods, aiming at their previous positions just in case the rebels do move in so that they can shell them. But then since the debate was announced, that these guys started to move back into their positions. So it's a dilemma that they are fully aware of.
Before I go back to questions here, and I want to get one other thing out on the table because you've raised it, and I think it's interesting to talk about. There is the threshold question of whether we strike or don't strike in Syria. The British Parliament last week decided not to support, even in principle, strike, even if no British soldier had to do a thing even in principle. They went very wobbly, I would have to argue, in that sense. If you decide, okay, there will be action, then the question is, what does that action consist of? And there are some who would say, look, if you're only going to do something symbolic, it's not worth doing anything at all, because as it is, Assad is essentially taking a victory lap, saying, I've made Obama blink. If a couple of missiles are lobbed into empty buildings, he'll come out again and say, you see, I've survived it, I'm stronger than ever. That's not useful. On the other hand, there are those who say, well, once you start, if you're going to go the other direction, eventually you're going to have boots on the ground, aren't you? So the question is, what do you target? I'm not sure it's really useful to have 535 members of Congress weigh in on that, but they may. But the question is, strategically, what do you do, and what's the theory, at least what's the theory behind it, because Congress can weigh in on that. So the theory might be, for example, that at the end of the day, Assad says, well, I guess I made a mistake, I don't want to repeat it again. And other dictators around the world say, there really is a price to using chemical weapons against civilians. That gives me pause. Or you could, again, you could say many other things. You could say, let's go after targets that don't move like airfields and planes move, but they sit in hangars when they're not flying. Can you do that? Go after Mrs. Assad's walk-in closet. That would upset her. Anyhow, what do you think should be targeted?
I mean, I think you just described kind of the sort of mental conversation that President Obama must have had with himself, right? In terms of how,
I hope with his national security statement.
The idea is that, okay, I don't want to be involved. So what do I do in order not to be involved, but in a way that at least maintains some sort of credibility for me as a president and for the United States more broadly? Now, ironically, by throwing it the way he did into Congress, now, he may still come out with a very limited strike and present that as a sort of face-saving thing, because now doing nothing at all is just the worst possible thing, having staked out his credibility on it. The thing is that at this point, the definition of what limited means is really the key subject of discussion here. If that is just to hit an empty headquarter, just to say that the United States hit something, I don't so much care about Assad's propaganda as to the value of our action, because ultimately it'll just make us look weak and just inconsequential, essentially. If, however, you do take out, like you said, the Air Force, and this is the position that Senator McCain and Graham yesterday talked about. If you do that, if you sort of bring in the word degrade Assad's military capability into the equation, seriously, and combine that with a broader strategy to work with a local asset like John was talking about, finally to start sort of having some sort of a force that has some sort of relation to you and your closer allies, then clearly you're shifting the momentum in a meaningful way. The problem is there was a leak, was it this morning or yesterday, in the Wall Street Journal, that Pentagon planners were told, supposedly by a senior official was saying that they were told that whatever strike should not be aimed at toppling the regime, and while they are interested in supporting the rebels, they don't want them to, they want to support them just enough but not to prevail. If this is the kind of logic that continues with whatever the nature of the strike, it's going to be very unhelpful moving forward. And the strike really, I mean, it could be still calibrated in such a way that it'll do damage to Assad, but if it's divorced from a broader strategy, I think that effect is going to be very limited.
I would just, trying to put myself in the shoes of the president. He has articulated his goal about CW and enforcing the taboo against its use and deterring and preventing future use or proliferation of these weapons. The whole question comes down to what kind of strike would it take to convince Assad not to deploy these again, that the United States does mean business, and that any kind of retaliation or further use of CW retaliation against the United States or Israel or any of our other friends in the region, or further use of CW, is going to be met with an even more punishing response. My guess is that it can't just be a shot across the bow or whatever the euphemisms have been put out there, at least not as those words are traditionally understood by anybody who's serious about these things. But you've really got to inflict a real cost and price on Assad, high-value targets that are important to his regime and its military capabilities. Exactly where that threshold is, I don't know. My instinct would be to tell the president, to err on the side of doing more rather than less. The less you do, the more likely he is to believe that he can challenge again, the more likely he believes, and the Iranians believe, that they can engage in some form of retaliation against us. This, in my entire experience, is a region where erring on the side of a more devastating, overwhelming strike against these actors like Assad, or for that matter the Iranians, is much better, is much safer than doing less, and in the end will cost the United States much less over the long term.
Got a question over here. Wait for the microphone. Just 1 second. Introduce yourself. It's coming from that side.
Polarics. By now, every target of consequence has already a kindergarten in front of it and automatically gets written off the list of targets. That's a fact. There is no question that the United States will not bomb any target once it's known that that is the situation. If you combine this with so in other words, whatever the United States can do as far as just bombing is concerned is symbolic. Doing it, in fact, is going to do more harm because it will be obviously as a proverbial tomahawk into an empty tent that was done in the 90s. Combine this with the fact that otherwise, for them it's an existential war. If they lose, they're slaughtered. They're not going to give up. They're not going to give up until the very end. So unless you send boots, unless you put boots on the ground, you haven't done anything. And that is something that Obama is not going to do. That's the situation. That's what we are facing here.
Want to comment on that? That's good.
Yeah, I think more broadly, I agree, though not with every detail. I think you can still hit targets that are going to be stationary, like I said, military bases, airfield hangars, missile silos. That just for instance, there's this one airfield, a very important airfield northeast of Damascus. It's really smack in the middle of the desert. It's not like an urban setting. And it's a critical airbase for resupplies from Iran, for instance. And it's one of the reasons why all this operation in northeastern Damascus is taking place. Because if the rebels start to control that stretch of land, the resupplies for the regime are going to be in danger. So there are similar targets like that I think you can take out, while also having an impact on the balance on the ground in terms of degrading Assad's key assets, Air Force or ballistic missiles or so on. Not so much, it's not so much important to me to take out a headquarter or even a unit of the 4th Division or what have you, as important as that may be. I think if you take out some of the real essential structures of his military machine, you can do what you said to an extent, but you cannot really do it all the way. And I think it's imperative in either case for the United States to make that strike at this point.
Just to remind you that when the nuclear reactor was taken out by Israel, the biggest danger that Israel feared that if they wait a little bit longer, there is going to be a kindergarten right in front of it.
Sure.
In the middle of nowhere.
Sure.
So the same thing applies to any airfield or anything else.
It's a reasonable concern. What about what impact would it have on the regime if its harbors were rendered useless?
In terms of
hard to do a floating kindergarten. One could, but
no, it's certainly part of the resupply chain for the regime. So it's clearly an important target. The question is, again, more political. Does the president want to do something that might be taken by the Russians as a direct affront? Does he want to open that kind of?
Well, and I think that's an interesting question to open up, whether he possibly does want to do
Right.
that. And the other aspect of that is, if you're going to target, if you're going to have a list of targets, you know that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and
Oh,
the
definitely.
Quds Force are there. If your intelligence can tell you where their command and control is, where they're stationed, it would certainly send a strong message were you to decide accidentally or on purpose to hit the Iranian assets in Syria.
No, I'm in agreement. I'm just I don't think the based on the reluctance that has been displayed in terms of even in the most limited and narrowly defined act, as the president himself said, that even then we're having this prevarication and this kind of big debate. So to go bigger just strikes me as kind of unrealistic.
Back there. Joel, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Joel Spray-Regan from the more or less peaceful city of Chicago. Tony, you mentioned success by the Kurds in northwest Syria. You mentioned Kurds, you have to think Turkey. What's Turkey's concern with that, and what are the possibilities of bringing Turkey on board? This is a peculiar history. Erdogan once wanted to be the peacemaker and to give the Golan Heights back to Assad. Obviously, he has a
The
very
good old
different-
days.
Yes, the good old days, yeah. Now he has a different point of view. I don't have to tell you fellows that we have air bases in Turkey, and he has a great interest in it and a great antagonism. Now, what are the chances of getting Turkey on board with air bases relatively close to Syria?
I think they offered them already, if I'm not mistaken. They offered the United States use of the Incirlik air base. So they've been, I mean, look, this is what they wanted for the longest time. I mean, the Turks have been trying to press this forever. And that's why when the president announced that it's going to be just a symbolic narrow strike, Erdogan kind of went, what? That's it? That's meaningless. We don't want that. We want to take out the regime and so on. So they're clearly very enthusiastic, and they are going to give support, and their support is going to be important on a number of fronts. With the Kurds too, that's another angle. I mean, I totally agree with John on the sort of the understudied dynamics and the importance of them in the Kurdish setting, not because of the PKK only, but because also of the strategic relationship between Ankara and the Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq, specifically President Barzani. I think that relationship is very important. It's very important in the Iraqi context. It's very important vis-a-vis Iran, and those things are going to play out in Syria as well. And despite the fact that Barzani is a Kurd, the people on the ground in northeastern Syria are not his Kurds. They are PKK Kurds. So he and the Turks are not necessarily on opposing sides in this situation. How they view and how they approach northeastern Syria.
Let me ask you, just, are the PKK Kurds in Syria, are they a group that with whom the U.S., for example, can make common cause, or really can't?
We haven't really. I mean, John is probably would know more about this, but they've tried. You know, the head of them. They've tried to make contact. They've made contact with the Turks. I mean, they're not in a great position, right? Because they're between sort of the Turkish hammer, the Jabhat al-Nusra anvil, and there's Barzani on the other side. So their position isn't very good. The danger that I had always thought about in this particular context is that these guys would make common cause with the Iranians, just to off balance the Turks and to off-balance Barzani, both within the Iraqi setting as well as in the Syrian setting. So far, it hasn't materialized. These guys, they went to Iran, they talked with the Iranians, they're flouting it as a possibility that we can always, do business with the Iranians and so on. But Turkey has been very savvy in this respect by opening peace talks with Öcalan, which kind of neutralizes that whole situation. So they're working with Barzani very closely, and they're trying to neutralize the PKK as much as possible, while still increasing pressure on the PKK in Syria. Why? To let Barzani's people into Syria. If you let Barzani's people into Syria, you make a balance between the Arabs on the one hand and your Kurdish allies on the other hand, and I think Turkey will be very comfortable in a situation, even if there is a PKK preponderance in northeastern Syria, as long as it's offset by Barzani and the just sort of incircumventable geographics of the area where the only outlet for these guys is Barzani's Kurdistan and Turkey. They're going to have to do business one way or another.
Do you have a sense of that, or?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. In fact, I agree with what Tony has said. I mean, the Turks, with respect to the Turks have done a lot more than the United States has with the PYD, the PKK affiliate on the ground in Syrian Kurdistan that is right now in a dominant position. Turks have invited the head of the PYD, Salah Muslim, for talks with their intelligence organization on several occasions. There's clearly an interest in the PYD in Syria and talking to Turkey and establishing some kind of relationship and coordination with them. And again, in the broader context of this Turkish Erdogan initiative to try and make peace with Kurds inside of Turkey and the PKK in particular, it does seem to me that this offers all kinds of opportunities for the United States to at least engage Syrian Kurds in a much more forceful way. I mean, as far as I can tell, all we've done to date is said you ought to forget being Kurds and be Arabs and fold yourself inside of the broader opposition and put away your demands of the Kurdish national movement. It seems to me that's exactly wrong. It's the exactly wrong thing that we want for Syria going forward in terms of its long-term future and the kind of state it eventually becomes. And given the fact that they are, whatever they are in terms of their communist background and the history of fighting Turkey, I think that's changing, and I think they are a very potent force for secularism that have engaged and have fought and have held ground and inflicted real damage on our real enemy in this part of the world over the long term, because the Iranian issue will somehow one day be resolved. But this phenomenon of the global Sunni Islamist terrorist network, the Kurds are willing to fight those people that pose a real danger to us in Syria, and I just think between us and the Turks and other actors in the region, including Barzani, we got to figure out a much more strategic approach to exploit that to our advantage.
Just a real quick follow-up on that. You know, one of the interesting things, although they've been fighting the Nusra and ISIS by themselves, they have resisted adamantly to allow Barzani-trained Kurdish forces to enter in from Iraq into Syria. So even though you know, they're in a fight, they feel that, you know, we'll take our chances and we'll fight it alone, but we don't want this to become an opportunity for Barzani to extend his influence into northeastern Syria. So Barzani can posture and say, well, yeah, we're all for the Kurdish, our Kurdish brethren in Syria. If you please open the border and let us come in, you know. But they don't. So they fear the influx of Barzani's influence more than they fear handling ISIS and Jabhat Nusra on their own effectively, which incidentally tells you, again, regarding the size and potency of ISIS and Jabhat Nusra vis-a-vis a small isolated group like the PYD fighting them in northeastern Syria.
You have another question back there, and then we'll come forward. Yeah.
Sure. Aaron Sabag from the American Turkish Council. Over the last week and a half, we've read in the papers about the administration's need to, in a sense, bifurcate the need to send a message against the proliferation of chemical weapons, but at the same time not over-expedite the end to the civil war that's been taking place. My question is, do you agree with the assessment of General Kane that he made earlier today, which is that because of the delay, our capacity to retaliate and actually target these chemical weapons that are mobile, in a sense, is no longer a real option, and that therefore by having to target the larger targets, larger strategic core assets of the regime, the only way we can discourage the proliferation of further chemical attacks is by, in a sense, responding in a manner that is, quote unquote, not proportional, but that's the only way to effectively discourage the regime from using the weapons. So I want to know if the delay of the Obama administration actually has made it impossible to separate, on one hand, the need to send a message on the proliferation, but at the same time not facilitate an end to this war in a relatively short time frame.
Well, I'll just throw this in, I mean, and there are probably different views, but I've heard from some military sources that it was never, no matter, at any point,
That's exactly right.
likely that you were going to target the chemical weapons
That's right.
themselves, because it is impossible to do and to destroy them in place, but very hard, and the threat of dispersal was such that you were not going to do that. You might hit command and control, but basically you were not going to try to wipe
That's
out
right.
the chemical weapons on the ground. Is that what you?
That's right.
That's your-
That was what I was going to say, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it was ever much of an option. I think it would have been great if it did exist, and it should definitely have been on a target. They probably should have been on our target list long ago. If we actually had a capability unilaterally to take these things out, we should have done it long ago, given the danger they pose, I think, intrinsically to American interests, especially if they go loose. But I don't have, based on what people have said, any conviction that that is a viable possibility militarily.
And the question is the delivery systems, as they're called. And so that's where you go back to the airfields, Air Force, and potentially ballistic missiles. And
Do you know, Tony, where the chemical weapons that Assad has stockpiled and utilized, were those manufactured in Syria, or were those brought in from outside?
Oh, yeah. No.
Manufactured, they have the scientific ability to make sarin gas and all that.
They have a huge enterprise there, and in terms of the weaponization, and this is one of the great things about the French intelligence report that was, it kind of details it really well, and details what they call the technological savvy in their deployment, which is really one of the main arguments as to why it was, was highly unlikely that this was the rebels who had used them, just by the method of deployment and how these guys are trained to do it. But in terms of weaponization, remember, in 2007 there was this massive explosion in Aleppo at a ballistic missile base that also happened to be where they were trying to weaponize Scuds with chemical warheads, and guess who was there? A lot of Iranian and North Korean guys. So these guys have been part of that enterprise as well.
Did it violate international law for Assad to be manufacturing and stockpiling these weapons over the past 3 years? We know.
My guess is not. I don't think he's a
He's not a signatory.
to
He's
the
not a
primary
signatory, so, yeah.
conventions on the production and development and stockpiling of CW.
Hi. I was wondering if you can comment.
Identify yourself if you
I'm
would.
Charles Schumann, empowered citizen.
Charles Schumann, what?
Empowered citizen. I was wondering if you could comment on the dichotomy between the Gulf financing for al-Qaeda groups within Syria, but then this newly assertive Saudi foreign policy that it seems very statist, much more secular, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-Salafist, and then secondly, the strategic implications for the United States and Israel if Saudi Arabia goes forward in coordinating any military movement with the opposition against the Assad regime, and the United States takes a back seat in that.
Yeah, no. In terms of the funding and the support, that was one of the main misconceptions from the very beginning of the war. Is that Saudi Arabia is funding it? Well, no, they're not. These guys, they've been getting really their support from private donors and private charities, mainly in Kuwait, but also in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. But essentially, Kuwait, the Salafi movement in Kuwait is very strong in supporting them. There's also part of this party called Hizb al-Ummah, which is it's kind of the main Islamist opposition party in the Gulf, both specifically in the United Arab Emirates, but also in Kuwait, that these guys and one of the main Salafi groups in Syria, Liwa al-Ummah, have good relations. Ahrar al-Sham have been getting from Kuwait. That's essentially where, Jabhat Nusra, I don't know what their funding streams are. ISIS, I'm assuming it's kind of also their independent thing that goes into, not just into what they can get from Iraq also, but whatever private donors are in the Gulf that support them and so on. But the other groups have been reliant on private charities, and you can see them. They go up, they have photos with them, YouTube, when they come in to kind of check in on their investments and kind of pose and take pictures and some in military fatigues or whatever, and go back home and raise more money. So that's really it, and that's why when you're going to move to the next stage, state sponsorship is always different, and that's why this is really a key issue in terms of how you can contain the situation in Syria, because of all the neighbors there being allies and being very much against the proliferation of this kind of thing on their border. They may do it in terms, I mean, the Turks have been very explicit about it. The Turks, there's a Turkish official who in April, anonymously obviously, said, look, we don't have really serious fears with regard to Jabhat Nusra. I mean, we don't think they're more than anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 guys. We don't feel that they're going to be really an effective political actor. So moving forward, they're not going to be really much of an issue. They could be a spoiler at best, but that's it. So that, I mean, I'm not saying he's right or wrong. I'm telling you how these guys are thinking about it. The Saudis don't want anything to do with that. Saudis just want to go with really vetted, apolitical almost movements in terms of merging Islam and Islamism and political activism. Anything that merges the two, they're going to stay away from, and they've stayed away from the Muslim Brotherhood, to be sure. And they're working with the Jordanians. And one of the things that I've heard from French and regarding to French assessments was that the attack that happened now in northeastern Damascus may have been, in fact, triggered in part by an influx of a force trained in Jordan, equipped with Saudi supplied weaponry. And northeastern Damascus also is the place of an Islamic formation called Liwa al-Islam, or Islam Brigade, that's very, very powerful. May have been the guys that killed Asif Shaukat in the assassination attempt. So these guys are entrenched in that area up there. So the combination of a force coming in from Jordan and the existence of this brigade and Saudi weapons influx may have actually precipitated Assad to really panic and do the attack at this point. So it does have an impact.
I would just to sort of your broader point on sort of what are we seeing happening in Saudi foreign policy. I do, I've watched it. I've talked to a lot of Saudis recently. I think there is something happening there. I think there is a significant evolution and shift that has occurred in Saudi foreign policy, particularly regarding this question of radical Salafist and Islamist movements. I think there is now a Saudi project after 9/11. It's taken a long time to get here, that realizes how much of a threat this is to the kingdom, that is much less nonchalant in terms of its, as long as you stay away from the kingdom, we'll pump out money and people and radical Islamists around the world. And I think that is change. There's something significant happening in official Saudi policy. I think on the one hand, to the extent it is that, it is getting after the funding and killing al-Qaeda and funding other people to go after radical Islamist movement and crush this phenomenon that we've seen take hold after the Arab uprisings of 2011. That's to be encouraged and worked with. What they've done in Egypt, I think, is very significant and very important. But I think it has a downside to the extent that you leave the Saudis alone to kind of do their own thing and seek self-help wherever they can get it, precisely because underlying all of this is a fundamental collapse in confidence in the United States and the United States partnership in Pax Americana in the Middle East that's existed at least since the end of World War II. The collapse of that order, the unreliability of that order, I think, can also lead to some very, very dangerous things in Saudi foreign policy that we have to be aware of and we have to stop. And my guess is, as distasteful as it continues to be to have the Saudis as a primary partner in this part of the world, as we've seen, there are lots worse things, including the Iranian nuclear bomb that's over the horizon. I think the Israelis realize that. I think there are interesting things happening. And again, I think there are Saudis, and I've heard people say that an essential part of Bandar's brief now, and I think Bandar is a huge part of this. Again, the fact that Bandar hasn't been in Washington throughout this entire period of the Arab Spring, it's just incredulous to me, given what's happening in Saudi foreign policy and the key role he's played as the key strategizer and implementer of this policy that is really beginning to have real impact on the ground in the Middle East on interests that are crucial to the United States, be it in Egypt or in Syria or vis-a-vis the Iranians. So I think we've really got to be engaged with him. We've got to get him to Washington. But part of his brief now is what I understand is a very thoughtful and introspective understanding of lessons learned from Afghanistan and the terrible mistakes that were made in allowing the Taliban to come to power and allowing jihadists to take over Afghanistan, and his determination to avoid that from happening in Syria, and his own sense that he's got a strategy and a way forward if he can get sufficient American help and cooperation in that to avoid that outcome. And my guess is the fact that we haven't had somebody like that who's been in Moscow, who's been in Paris, who's been in London, talking about all these things is, I think, only highlights the level of unseriousness that has existed in the administration's Syria policy for more than 2 years now.
What's your reading of the Qatari role? Usually the Qataris take the side the Saudis are not on. What are they doing? Do we know?
I mean, they continue to fund, and they bought recently, I think, some, a consignment of weapons from Libya, and that they've distributed mainly in the northern part of Syria.
To
Just local, I mean, Islamists probably dominated because
the
of
rumor is that
landscape.
they do so that they have supported the Al Qaeda affiliates. So we're unproven, and we don't know.
No, I don't think that's proven in any way, and I would actually highly doubt it. In fact, I mean, they have a network of local Salafi groups that they have there, that they've built a good relationship with, that they've been given. But now, now that precisely because of Bandar's effort, I think they're not out of the scene. I mean, so it's a mistake to say, oh well, they kind of sat aside and let the Saudis take over. No, they're still doing what they're doing, but they're not actively trying to kind of outbid the Saudis in Syria.
Just on the Qataris, my sense that this is a time to really yank their chain very, very hard on this, together with some of our other friends in the region. I think, I'm not sure I've yet seen a really great analysis of what the sudden change in leadership in Qatar really means in a strategic sense, what opportunities it creates. It's a time of flux. This guy's got to establish his leadership, even if he has his father and his mother behind him trying to pull the strings. But it does strike me that these are the kinds of times with a young, untested leader who is looking for some friends in the region, both regarding what they're doing in Syria, what they've done in Egypt, what they continue to do with Al Jazeera on a lot of fronts, that this is a time for big heavyweight powers like the United States and Saudi Arabia and others to really go in there and talk straight to this guy and try and get them to back off of some of the things that I think they've done over the course of the last decade that are extremely detrimental to U.S. interests.
Right here, Omar.
My name is Amir Abbas Fakhravar. I'm president of Iranian Freedom Institute, Iranian, and I guess Iranian American now. It's so strange when a leader of country like Bashar al-Assad is calling himself follower of Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Islamic Republic of Iran. In several occasions he said that, and even he said Khomeini his leader. And then right now, President Obama wants to just go and hurt the snake, not kill the snake, and it's clear in his policy. He's not going to change the regime in Syria. He's just going to do something to say that I did something. And you don't think it will be a lot more hurtful for the American allies in that area, because then Islamic Republic of Iran, Khomeini, they have something to go and defend, and they will have some legitimacy to go and defend Bashar al-Assad, to help them to hurt the American allies in that area. It's not better right now to ask the Congress to push for all or nothing policy, to just push for going for regime change and make sure that Iran cannot have any hope to bring up Assad again in Syria to the power.
I mean, ultimately, I think in terms of objective, from my perspective, the objective, I mean, the declared policy of the United States, as a matter of fact, is that Assad has to go, right? I mean, it's stated in the mildest and ambivalent way possible. Nevertheless, it is what's the stated policy. So I think the idea of somehow the objective of this being other than the removal of the regime, first of all, it's unrealistic, but second, it is a mistake. I've been, personally, in my writing, I've been against the notion of a power-sharing deal or Geneva or what have you, transitional government in which primarily because it's just fanciful, the idea that these guys are going to sit down and they're going to have mutual veto power in putting up some sort of a government that has no power whatsoever, and Assad would be essentially the power behind it anyway. So I think all of that is just in the realm of fantasy as it is, but whether the president is going to push there, we go back to the conversation that Cliff was talking about earlier. How do I do this without getting involved? Because I clearly don't want to be involved, and I see this that opening a slippery slope where I'm going to have to be involved. The question really is now whether the dynamics are such that ultimately it's going to force his hand one way or another. What we've seen over the past week is precisely the show of how uncomfortable he is with facing that eventuality. The question is, once it's staring him in the face, what is he going to do? And that's what we're going to see. I can't answer that.
I would just say I think we'd be remiss if we, if any of my friends who follow American domestic politics were watching this and nobody has said one word about the kind of domestic politics
Sure.
that the administration and all of these congressmen who have to make this fateful
Sure.
decision are operating in. I mean, this is the most poisonous atmosphere regarding American engagement in the world and undertaking difficult national security missions that I can, certainly remember in my lifetime. Anybody who looks at preliminary whip counts of what's going to happen in the Congress, I think you've got to be quite pessimistic. And it's going to be by the grace of God that I think the president, and with a lot of help from traditional national security Republicans, and hopefully anybody in this room or beyond that really cares about America and its role in the world and maintaining this kind of liberal global order that served our interests so well for most of the last 6 or 7 decades. I think people have got to be out there and saying, yes, there are no good choices. This is a very, very difficult mission that we want to undertake here. But for the United States to turn its back and say no on this and to duplicate what the British Parliament has done, it seems to me everything will then, the world will be measured in things that happened before the American vote on Syria and after the American vote on Syria, because it will be a very much transformed world, and my guess and my fear is that in radically more dangerous ways.
Let's dig, I think you're absolutely right to bring that up, and let's dig a little deeper into that, and let me outline a scenario and then we can talk about it. It seems to me that on the Senate side, probably Obama gets the authorization he seeks. Harry Reid keeps his people together. You've got McCain, you've got Lindsey Graham. That doesn't bring everybody along, but it probably brings most of the Senate. The House side, it seems to me, is where it gets very complex, because I can easily imagine John Boehner saying to Nancy Pelosi, if you can't bring your Democrats to support your president, do not rely on us to do so. And the Republicans can have a range of reasons for refusing to support Obama, from he won't do enough to we don't trust him to, there's all sorts, there's just many different things they can say as to why they decided they couldn't give him what they would characterize as a vote of confidence, having separate almost from the foreign policy implications here, based on everything else. So that's where it seems to me it gets really dangerous. And you also do have these odd alliances of left-wing Democrats and kind of libertarian, neo-isolationist Republicans. So again, Rand Paul and Dennis Kucinich do sound an awful lot alike, although you can also say that liberal interventionists can sound a lot like neoconservatives at this moment. But it gets back to what you said at the opening of this. Obama has taken a huge gamble by saying, I'm going to let Congress tell me their will, and then he has to decide whether, as he can, I'm going to say if Congress does not give him the support he seeks, he goes ahead with it anyway, or he says, well, what can I do? My hands have been tied. Let's discuss this. I don't know about it. Making predictions is very hard in this instance. It's very
I think it's incredibly difficult. I think somehow what has to happen here, and I agree entirely with your assessment of sort of what's the likelihood, and the Senate is somewhat safer. I think the House is going to be the real problem. You do have this alliance between Tea Party people and anti-war Democrats that I think is very dangerous, dangerous to the Republican Party and dangerous, obviously, specifically to this vote and what it says about America's role in the world. My only faith is that, despite the fact he has shown almost no really serious capability, not only internationally, as demonstrated by the British vote, but domestically, to really go out and lead and whip and form, mobilize coalitions behind his objectives, unless he demonstrates that now with these Democrats, including a lot of these liberal, anti-war Democrats, and says to them, if you want to destroy my presidency and live with the presidency for the next 3 years in which I am an impotent and destroyed and humiliated figure, go right ahead, but I'm going to make every day of your life a sheer and living hell if you do that to us and do that to the country. I think he's got to really break arms here on his side, and I think Cliff's exactly right. He's got to be able to bring a significant majority of his side of Democrats to a yes vote here, in which case then I hope that there are sufficient traditional national security Republicans that their proclivity is to defer to any commander-in-chief when he's made a decision about the use of force. They understand that's the best thing for the country, despite the fact that a large, distinct block of those have absolutely no trust in this commander-in-chief. And then there's another block that I do think exists, however small it may be, that are so pissed off at this guy, they are just looking, they're not thinking about national security, they're looking for any chance to inflict a real political defeat on him. And I think somehow, if the president can bring his side to this, we have to hope that enough people, and unfortunately in some ways I think the Israelis are going to be brought into this. I wish to God that some of our other allies in the region could be brought to this, both in NATO and in the Middle East, to come talk to these congressmen and explain to them from a regional perspective what the world looks like after a no vote and how disastrous that'll be for the United States, how disastrous that'll be for the Middle East and the entire international system. I think if all of that gets done and the stars are all aligned, he might squeak through, and the country might squeak through, but it's a terrible position.
Joel, you have another question, a comment on this?
Yeah. As a strong Zionist with a grandson serving in the Israeli army, I'm concerned by what you just said. It's in America's interest to do this. It's in civilization's interest to do this. But to push this as in Israelis' interest, as in Israel's interest, is the worst signal. It will be said, and you know this, that America is being sent to war to bail out the Jews.
Listen, I don't want Israel to be in the middle of this, but the fact is, I can tell you for sure that the entire organized pro-Jewish community in this town is going up and quietly and discreetly talking to people on the Hill and saying that a disaster for Israel would be a no vote here and the complete loss and collapse of American credibility and deterrence in the Middle East. And that goes for Israel, I think, and it goes for every other country in that region that considers itself a friend of the United States, as well as NATO, who's been silent in this. I agree entirely that this has to be very quietly. It's much better if Israel, but I can tell you the administration, and it's been widely reported, is depending on Israel and using the threat of Iran and the threat of Iran to Israel if this goes badly for the administration, to try and whip these people who maybe won't be convinced by anything else regarding the president and his credibility and his word, but if they understand the ramifications of this on Israel's security, maybe, just maybe, those guys change their calculations and become a yes vote. I mean, this is hardcore politics in this town.
And what an odd situation if, and I hope I'm not oversimplifying this too much, the president can get the support of his own party only with the help of AIPAC. I mean, isn't that what we're saying here, really? Maybe that. Let's try, John, you and I remember, we recall speaking with fairly high-level people in the State Department like 2 years ago at the time when it was, the conventional wisdom was Assad was going to fall, and there was no need even to do anything about it. It was happening. The most important effort was diplomatic, to get Russia to cooperate with the U.S. on that. Russia did not cooperate. It appears there's going to be another attempt to get Russia to cooperate. My guess is that is going to fail, but maybe, as usual, well, I try to be cynical, but it's hard to keep up. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you can characterize the administration's policy over that, it's just basically premised on avoidance. Whatever we can do to avoid. Meaning, if you can use the Russians to avoid having to do that, that's fine. If you can say, well, he's going to fall anyway, therefore we don't really need to do anything, that's fine as well. It was never going to be like that. And the Russians understood it, that, there's no political solution. That's why they're pumping him with weapons all the time, and as are the Iranians, and sending their own militias. They understand. We can, to our heart's content, keep on saying there is no military solution, there is only a political solution. Yeah, nobody cares. I mean, they are fighting it on a military basis. That's how it's going to be settled, one way or another. I mean, yeah, okay, you can say a political solution happens after he's militarily defeated, in the sense, if you define political solution as, okay, which road can I take out of Damascus as a political solution, fine. But the notion that he is going to negotiate the structuring of a government and his, it was never going to happen, So I think it's just, now we're kind of paying the price of all these two things. I mean, on the one hand, the fantasy of how this, or the misunderstanding of how this conflict was always going to play out. And second, the fact that we didn't move in to anticipate it and build, not just anticipate chemical weapons use or any of that, but to anticipate building assets that now we have to kind of scramble to look around and do.
There is this, I would just say, there is this idea that's been put out there and floated by quite serious people that there still may be, over the course of the next week, some kind of play in which, in order to stay an American attack and prevent it from happening, in exchange for kind of saving Syria and saving the regime from that military attack, the Russians go ahead and exercise real muscle on Assad to take control of his CW and remove it, get it out of the country. To my own mind, I just don't see my way from here to there, especially given all the buildup to this limited strike, shot across the bow. It's hard for me, given the state of the relations between Obama and Putin, that Putin sees any interest in saving Obama from what it looks like the potential mess he's gotten himself in, and what a mess he could be getting himself into if he tries to intervene in Syria, and what it's doing to him domestically and otherwise. So unless the president is able to really talk brass tacks with Putin in Russia and put the fear of God into him that the United States is really going to threaten this regime, which I think has been the only way ever throughout the last 2 years to have any prospect of getting Putin to the negotiating table in any kind of serious way to salvage some form of Russian equity inside of Syria and the broader Middle East, that only by United States actually getting into this game in a serious way, rather than telling everybody we're never going to get into it because we don't have an interest here, I think that just has left the field open for Putin and gives him absolutely zero incentive to cooperate with the United States. The separate question is, at this point, given the value that Assad and the regime and the Alawites clearly put on these weapons, could the Russians really, even if they wanted to, get Assad to give these up? Is that a risk that they're willing to take? And I have extreme doubts about that. They have made their mark and points in this conflict by showing the world that the United States, at the drop of a hat, something happens, will abandon allies immediately. Russia's there for the long haul. Whether you like our allies or don't like them, we have a constant, predictable, certain, strong policy to protect our friends and fight our enemies in the region, and that's what we're doing. And in the absence of the U.S. being involved in this, I think you'll see things happen like what's happened with the Saudis and the Russians. Everybody begins to change their strategic calculations and to look for advantages in places where they never would have looked for it before, with potentially very uncertain consequences.
I mean, ironically, had the president not boxed himself in with his own rhetoric on this, I think he and the Russians would have shared precisely this shared interest of trying to stay an American strike by saying, oh, you know what, let's climb down from this by going back to a renewed push for diplomacy, and this way he comes out of it. I mean, that's one like cynical way to look at it, but I don't think, judging from the precedent, that would have been an impossibility. I think he's just trapped by the fact that he has to do something, and he doesn't consequences of once he takes the action on how that might affect any potential renewed talks with the Russians. The Russians don't have any other game other than that. The Russians, they don't have any other ability to affect the situation unless they're being given a central role by the administration to be a primary political broker. Otherwise, they don't. It's not a natural role for them. The more curious possibility and danger, in my mind, is whether, I mean, I don't necessarily see it as a likelihood, but the Iranians are the ones who are working a very strong angle now to try to stay the president's hand on striking in Syria by trying to present all kinds of opportunities that we somehow share, be it on chemical weapons. Rouhani comes out on Twitter, and Zarif comes out in the New York Times and says, yes, we have suffered chemical weapons as well, and Rafsanjani puts out that little thing that that the Assad regime is responsible for it. See, we have an opening to start talking, bring us in on the Syria discussion, and so on. And I think, while I don't necessarily think it's going to lead anywhere, that I think is an even bigger danger for the United States if the president, if we don't get the strike, and he's looking for a way to climb down from this, and somehow he succumbs to the pressure of getting the Iranians to kind of help him solve it and move from there to nuclear talks. And I think that would really be a critical mistake. I'm
going to ask one last question. This will be the wrap up for as well as you address it, and that is to say that it seems to me that the Obama administration did make it our policy, make it the U.S. policy that Assad should fall, but he has willed the ends without willing the means, has not come up with a strategy, nor a vision for what a post-Assad Syria would look like. I do worry, not all my friends agree, what would happen to the Alawites beyond the power structure. I don't want to see them slaughtered. I'd worry about the Christians who may be seen as, although I don't think they are, as allies or lapdogs of the Alawites. And I think I do have a concern for the Druze and for the Kurds and others there. Is there a vision for a post-Assad Syria that we should be looking to begin to shape realistically? And would it be a patchwork quilt, a highly decentralized state, or is it has it become impossible to do? Assad falls, civil war continues, and at the end of the day, probably some faction among the Sunnis take control, and with a lot of bloodshed.
Right. I mean, I think the Kurdish and Druze situation are kind of unique because of their extensions beyond Syria and the power centers that exist beyond Syria that could help them mitigate the repercussions. The Christians, obviously, I mean, as a small minority with no real serious patron, will either be ignored or will leave for the most part, or kind of, adapt by sort of quietly falling into the fold of whatever order comes. The Alawites are the issue, not just in terms of slaughter. I don't necessarily believe in this massive, ethnic cleansing campaigns. We don't really have, with the exception of the Turkish precedent in the early 30s, we don't really have that kind of a mass killing of ethnic groups even in the most severe civil wars, be it Lebanon, be it Iraq, and you don't really have that in those numbers. Will they be marginalized politically? Probably, yes. But here's where this is controversial perhaps, but I am not sure that in terms of if the core interest for the United States is to undercut Iranian influence in Syria, and if the Alawites, I'm not talking about average, Joe Schmo Alawite, right? And we're talking about power centers, which are linked to the Assad family directly. There are no alternative power, centers. If any of those are grafted onto a political reality, and insofar as they continue to be a bridge for Iranian influence, to continue to have a seat at the table, veto this, control this security service, maintain a link to Hezbollah, I think that will be counterproductive. So political participation for the Alawites has to be handled gently, not along the lines of a Lebanese Ta'if Accord, whereby they get to have the kind of stake that can determine the direction of key national security and foreign policy affairs. I know it's not a popular position, but I feel that that if Syria is going to be remotely aligned with, if not directly the United States, at least with the United States' friends in the region, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and so on, it's going to have to be dominated by Sunnis.
I would just, I think it is an important issue. I don't think enough people have thought about it. I think the reality is, as I said before, that I think the fiction that's been known as Syria, that's existed in the 20th century, we can debate how much it actually became a real national entity. I think it's finished. I think we've got to begin adjusting to that reality. I think in lots of ways, if we can shape it, it's very much in our interest to see this occur, and perhaps not only in Syria if it's well managed. So I think putting this thing back together again is impossible. I know it's impossible in the Kurdish areas. My guess is it'll be impossible in the Alawite areas as well. This is going to, at best, if there continues to be a Syrian state with a seat at the United Nations, going to look something, and should look something much more like the form of what we've seen in terms of Kurdish autonomy in Iraq than it is going to be like anything we saw before 2011. My own feeling is it's strongly in our interest to see it that way, that having a strong dictatorial, brutal, and centralizing government in Damascus run by a small minority has, for the better part of at least 40 years, been a disaster for American and Western interests in the Middle East and a constant thorn in our side. And I think the sooner we can adjust to a new reality and take advantage of it and exploit it and really shape it with allies on the ground, I think the better off that we'll be. Exactly what the contours and how that looks, I'm not sure. We'll have to see as it unfolds. But I think it's that more fundamental paradigm shift in reality that we need to begin thinking seriously about and putting serious brain power to.
Thank you, John. Well, I hope you agree, at least on this, that it's been a very fast and substantive hour and a half of discussion. I'd like to ask you to thank our panel, thank Tony and John. And thank you all for coming. We'll have more sessions like this in the future.